It was an ordinary day at the hospital. Or so everyone thought. The nurses moved through their shifts, their faces weary from the endless rounds, unaware of the man who had just walked through the doors. He was a black man, dressed in plain clothes, with a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the busy atmosphere. As he sat in the waiting room, a few nurses exchanged quiet whispers and laughter, making jokes at his expense, thinking nothing of it. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the man sitting before them wasn't just another patient. He was the owner of the very hospital they worked in. The laughter echoed softly as one nurse, oblivious to his presence, made a comment about his appearance, dismissing him as just another patient who didn't belong. Another nurse chimed in with a laugh, obliviously adding to the ridicule. But the man remained silent, his expression unreadable. It wasn't anger they saw in his eyes, rather, it was a quiet understanding, as if he knew exactly what was about to unfold. As the minutes passed, the hospital's director, a busy figure who rushed through the hallways with papers in hand, caught sight of the man in the waiting area. He approached him, his face lighting up in recognition. "Dr. Carter," he said, offering a handshake. "We weren't expecting you today." The nurses, who had been gossiping moments earlier, froze in place. They exchanged confused glances, trying to process what had just happened. "Dr. Carter?" The name rang a bell, but they couldn't quite place it. The director continued, "It's great to have you here. Sir, your input on the upcoming staff meeting will be invaluable." One of the nurses, realizing too late who he was, turned pale. She stepped forward, stammering an apology. I didn't know. Sir, I'm so sorry." Dr. Carter smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He nodded politely, accepting the apology but not offering any reassurance. "No harm done," he said calmly. However, as he walked away with the director, the air in the room seemed to shift. The nurses were left standing in stunned silence, each of them realizing the weight of their actions. They had mocked a man they now knew held the power to change the course of their careers. But it was something more profound than that. In that moment, they were faced with the stark realization of their own prejudice and the fine line between civility and disrespect. The day would continue, but nothing would ever quite be the same for those who had laughed. The laughter echoed through the hallway as the nurses continued their playful chatter. The man, seemingly unfazed by their remarks, sat patiently in the sterile waiting room, flipping through a magazine. He knew that he could have easily stood up and revealed his identity. But he chose to remain silent. Sometimes, he believed, it was better to let people's true nature reveal itself. Minutes later, a nurse came to collect him for his appointment. She barely looked at him, still too caught up in her conversation with a colleague. "Come on, sir," she said with a forced smile, oblivious to who he was. He rose from his seat, following her down the long corridor, where the whispers of the other nurses began to fade behind them. As they entered the examination room, he sat quietly while she prepared the necessary documents. His mind wandered back to his decision to invest in the hospital years ago, a decision that had been met with skepticism by many of his colleagues. Who never thought a man like him could truly own such a place? But now, as the hospital grew and became a pillar of the community, the same people who doubted him were the ones who never imagined they could one day answer to him. A few minutes later, the head nurse, who had been the loudest in her mocking laughter, walked in to check on the patient. The moment she saw him, her face froze. Recognition flashed across her eyes. But it was too late. The man, now fully aware of her sudden shift in demeanor, offered a calm smile. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice steady. The nurse stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. I didn't realize. I'm so sorry. I didn't know who you were." With a quiet chuckle, he leaned back in his chair. "It's all right, but perhaps it's time for some lessons in respect, don't you think?" The nurse stood there, her face turning pale as she stammered, clearly trying to find the right words to undo the damage. The silence in the room stretched on, making the tension feel even more suffocating. She finally managed to speak, her voice shaky. I truly didn't mean any harm. It was just a joke. Please, don't let this affect my job." The man didn't immediately respond, his eyes steady and piercing. For a moment, it almost felt as if he was weighing her every word. He could have easily fired her on the spot or made an example of her in front of the others. But instead, He took a deep breath and spoke calmly. "It's not about the joke. It's about understanding your role here. You're not just here to care for patients physically, you're here to treat them with dignity. Regardless of who they are." The nurse nodded, clearly chastened, but still unsure of what to say next. "I'll let this one slide." The man continued, his voice firm yet not unkind. "But I suggest you reflect on your actions. A mistake like this can cost more than just your reputation. It can harm someone who might not have the same patience I do." Just as he finished speaking, another nurse entered the room, completely unaware of the conversation. Her eyes flickered between the man and her colleague. Sensing the tension in the air, the head nurse quickly straightened up, wiping away any traces of nervousness and forcing a smile. "Everything okay in here?" the new nurse asked, giving a confused look at the silent exchange. "Everything is fine," the man replied, his voice returning to its calm and collected tone. "I'll be heading back now." He stood up and headed for the door, but not before one last glance at the nurse who had mocked him earlier. She was still standing motionless, unsure of what would happen next. As he stepped into the hallway, he could hear the voices of the nurses resume their chatter. But this time, they were quieter, more cautious. He knew that it wouldn't be long before the rumors began to spread, that the quiet man they had laughed at was the one who held the power in their hospital. As the man walked down the sterile hallway, he could hear the hushed whispers behind him, the same nurses who had mocked him now speaking in a tone he could barely make out. They had no idea that their jokes had cost them more than just a moment of laughter. They had cost them their sense of security. He reached the lobby and paused for a moment. The hospital was a place where lives were saved, where the community came for care. And yet, here he was, seeing how easily some of the staff had forgotten their purpose. The laughter still rang in his mind. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Hayes?" He turned to see the hospital administrator approaching him, her face a mixture of concern and curiosity. She had always been professional, someone who maintained a balance between managing the hospital and respecting its patients. But even she couldn't hide the slight hesitation in her eyes when she saw him. "Is everything all right, Mr. Hayes? I hope there were no issues during your visit," she asked, her tone polite but tinged with nervousness. Mr. Hayes smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "There were no issues, just some lessons to be learned." The administrator blinked, clearly not understanding what he meant. "Lessons? Some of your staff have a lot to learn about respect and professionalism," he said, his voice low but sharp. "But I'm sure they'll figure it out." He didn't wait for her to respond. Instead, he walked past her toward the exit, knowing that the hospital would soon be buzzing with the news of his visit, and that the nurses who had laughed at him would have to live with the consequences of their actions. Outside, the crisp air hit him, a sharp contrast to the stuffy atmosphere inside. As he made his way to his car, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. There was always something he could have done differently. He could have stood up right then and there, made an example of the nurses in front of everyone, and left them trembling in their positions. But instead, he had chosen restraint. He was a man who had worked hard to build something meaningful, something that helped people, and in the end, he knew that action spoke louder than words. Back inside the hospital, word spread quickly. The nurses who had laughed at him were now nervously awaiting their next steps. What they didn't know was that Mr. Hayes had made arrangements to observe their work in the coming days, not to punish them, but to ensure that the lesson had truly sunk in. As the man walked through the sterile corridors of the hospital, he could hear hushed conversations behind closed doors. The nurses were no longer laughing. In fact, they were exchanging nervous glances, uncertain about what they had just witnessed. Word would spread quickly about the man's true identity, and it wouldn't be long before their behavior caught up with them. The man's footsteps echoed against the tile floors as he made his way to his office, a quiet determination in his every step. He'd been running the hospital for years now, but it was moments like this that reminded him of the battles he'd faced. The subtle racism, the doubts cast by his colleagues, and the prejudices that existed even in a place meant to care for others. It was all part of the challenge. Entering his office, he sat down behind his desk, reflecting on how far he had come. His mind wandered back to the early days of his career. He had worked tirelessly to prove himself, not only to those who doubted his abilities but to those who believed someone of his background didn't belong in a leadership role in such an institution. It was a fight he hadn't given up on. Even when others had tried to undermine him. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. His fingers steady despite the weight of the situation. It was time to make sure this lesson was one that would stick, not just for the nurse, but for the entire hospital staff. "Hello, Susan," he said when the line clicked. "I need you to set up a meeting with the entire staff. It's important." There was a pause before Susan's voice came through the phone. Concerned but professional. "Of course, Dr. Harris. Is everything okay?" "Yes, everything's fine," he replied, though the edge in his voice betrayed the seriousness of the request. "Just make sure everyone attends." As he hung up the phone, he leaned back in his chair, contemplating how to approach the meeting. He knew that this would be a defining moment. He wasn't one to make rash decisions. But this was about more than a simple apology. It was about changing the culture in this hospital. He wanted to make sure no one would ever again feel the way he had been made to feel earlier. The next day, the entire hospital staff gathered in the conference room. Nurses, doctors, administrators, and support staff filled the seats, murmuring among themselves as they waited for the meeting to begin. There was a certain unease in the air, a sense of anticipation that grew thicker with every passing minute. No one was sure what the meeting was about. But the rumors had already begun to spread about the man they had unknowingly mocked the day before. They had learned who he was, the owner of the hospital, and it seemed like everyone was now on edge. Dr. Harris stood at the front of the room, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. As the murmurs died down, he spoke, his voice steady and commanding. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "I've called this meeting today for one reason and one reason only. To remind us all of the core values we are meant to uphold, both as healthcare professionals and as human beings." There was a brief silence. Everyone in the room could feel the gravity of his words. "Yesterday," Dr. Harris continued, his gaze scanning the room, "I witnessed behavior that has no place in this hospital. It was a behavior that goes against everything we stand for. Some of you, out of ignorance or simple thoughtlessness, laughed at a patient. You mocked him because of the color of his skin." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The room was still, the weight of the situation hanging in the air like a thick fog. "I don't need to tell you that the man you mocked was not just any patient. He was the owner of this hospital, the one you work for. The one who helps fund the very salaries you receive. But that's not the point. The point is that no matter who walks through these doors, they deserve respect. Every single person, whether they are a patient or a colleague, deserves to be treated with dignity. And that starts with each and every one of you." There was an uncomfortable shuffle in the room. Some nurses shifted in their seats. Others looked at the floor. But none of them met Dr. Harris's gaze. He had their attention now. But the truth was hard to swallow. "As a leader, I have a responsibility to make sure that this hospital is a place where all people, no matter their background, their race, or their status, are treated fairly. But I also have a responsibility to ensure that the values we profess are actually lived by each of us in our daily actions." Yesterday was a reminder that we are not there yet. He glanced at the head nurse, the one who had been most vocal in her mockery the day before. She had her head down now, her face flushed with embarrassment. Dr. Harris's expression softened, but there was still a firmness in his voice. "I want to make one thing clear. I'm not here to fire anyone or to make an example out of you. That would be easy. But what I want is a hospital-wide commitment to do better. Starting today, I'm going to be implementing new training programs to ensure we all understand the importance of empathy, respect, and professional behavior. We will also be having regular check-ins to discuss how we are creating an inclusive and supportive environment for all of our patients." The room remained silent as he finished speaking. The nurses and doctors now seemed to fully understand the seriousness of the situation. "I trust that none of you will make the same mistake again. If you do, you will be held accountable, just as you would hold a patient accountable for their actions. Do we understand each other?" A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the room, though some still seemed uncomfortable. Dr. Harris gave a slight nod. "Good, let's move forward with a renewed sense of respect, for each other and for every person who walks through these doors." With that, he dismissed the meeting, and the staff began to file out, each person reflecting on what had just transpired. For many, it was a moment of discomfort, a moment of realization, but for Dr. Harris, it was a necessary step in creating the kind of hospital he had always dreamed of, a place where every person, regardless of who they were, could receive care without prejudice. The days following the meeting were tense. Dr. Harris had made his intentions clear. But the true test would come in the weeks to follow. The staff began to notice a shift in the way people interacted. There was a certain wariness now. An air of caution, as if everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. No one was sure how to proceed after the confrontation in the meeting. But one thing was certain. Dr. Harris had made an impression. And it was clear that any disrespect would no longer be tolerated. At the end of the first week, Dr. Harris decided to check in with a few of the nurses. He didn't want to make them feel singled out, but he knew it was important to gauge how things were progressing and if any real change had occurred. He found one of the nurses, Clara, sitting in the break room. She was a young woman, only a few years out of nursing school, but she had a certain presence about her. Clara had been one of the nurses who had laughed the loudest at the patient the day before Dr. Harris's revelation. He wasn't sure how much her perspective had shifted, but he hoped to hear her thoughts. "Clara," he began, his voice neutral, but his eyes sharp. "How have you been settling in after the meeting?" She looked up at him, a bit startled by his direct approach. But she quickly regained her composure. "It's been difficult," she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. And I honestly feel ashamed of myself. I didn't realize the harm I could cause with something as simple as a laugh. I thought it was just a joke. But I see now that it wasn't." Dr. Harris nodded, giving her space to continue. He wasn't looking for excuses. But he understood that change took time. "I think a lot of us didn't realize how deeply ingrained our biases were." Clara continued, looking down at her hands. "We've all been trained to be professional. But professionalism doesn't mean we've examined our own prejudices. It's uncomfortable, but I think it's something we need to address." "That's a good start," Dr. Harris replied, his voice warm but serious. "Recognizing that change is needed is the first step. The second step is committing to doing better every single day. Every patient who walks through these doors deserves the best care. Not just because they need treatment, but because they deserve to be treated as human beings." Clara nodded, visibly moved. "I want to do better. I really do. I think I need to start by listening more, understanding the people I'm treating. Not just seeing them as patients, but as individuals." Dr. Harris gave a slight smile, sensing the sincerity in her words. "That's the right attitude. It won't always be easy. But it's worth it. We all have a responsibility to build an environment where everyone feels safe and respected. And that starts with each of us." As Clara left the break room to return to her duties, Dr. Harris watched her go, quietly hopeful that this shift wasn't just a temporary reaction to his words, but a genuine change of heart. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Harris continued his efforts. He oversaw the new training programs he had implemented, ensuring that they weren't just about ticking off boxes, but about truly reshaping the culture of the hospital. He arranged for guest speakers, held group discussions, and encouraged open dialogue about racism, prejudice, and biases, topics that had long been ignored in many corners of the healthcare system. Still, not everyone was on board with the changes. Some staff members resisted, claiming the focus on diversity and inclusivity was unnecessary, that it distracted from the real work of healing. These voices were quiet, but Dr. Harris knew they were there, simmering beneath the surface. He would have to address them eventually. But for now, he chose to focus on the progress being made, however small it seemed. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings and check-ins, Dr. Harris stood by his office window, looking out over the city skyline. He thought back to the day he had first bought the hospital. How many people had doubted him then? It seemed fitting, in a way, that the real challenge wasn't about running a hospital. It was about changing the mindset of those who worked there. He sighed and turned away from the window. There was still much to be done, but he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He knew that real change wasn't going to happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and patience, but he was ready for the fight. He always had been. And then, as if the weight of the moment finally caught up with him, he smiled to himself, knowing that the hospital, his hospital, was beginning to change in ways that mattered more than anything else. Weeks turned into months, and Dr. Harris' efforts to reshape the hospital's culture were slowly but surely making an impact. The new training programs were starting to yield results, and the staff, though hesitant at first, were beginning to adopt a more empathetic approach toward their patients. Conversations that had once been uncomfortable now felt more natural, and staff members were engaging in honest discussions about race, bias, and privilege, topics that had previously been swept under the rug. However, not everyone had fully embraced the change. A few of the older, more entrenched members of the staff remained resistant, muttering about how things were getting out of hand, or how they missed the good old days when things were simpler. Dr. Harris knew that some would never fully come around, but he was determined to continue pushing forward for those who were willing to learn and grow. One day, as he walked through the hospital, he overheard a conversation between a few nurses. This time, the tone was different. There was no mocking, no whispering in hushed voices. One of the nurses was sharing her experience with a recent patient who had been a victim of racial prejudice elsewhere, and how she had taken the time to listen to his story without judgment. "It felt right," the nurse said, her voice soft but steady. "It felt like I was doing more than just my job. I was making a difference." Dr. Harris paused for a moment, listening in from a distance. His heart swelled with pride. It wasn't perfect, there was still much work to be done, but the seeds of change had been planted. It was the beginning of something new, something better. In the following months, Dr. Harris decided it was time for another meeting, but this one would be different. This time, he would not focus on the mistakes of the past. Instead, he would celebrate the progress the hospital had made and the hard work that had gone into creating a more inclusive and compassionate environment. The staff gathered once again in the conference room, but this time the atmosphere was lighter, less tense. There was a sense of accomplishment in the air, a collective recognition that the hospital was on the right path. Dr. Harris stood at the front of the room, a rare smile on his face. "I've been watching and listening," he began, his voice filled with quiet pride. "And I've seen the change. It's in the way you interact with each other and with the patients. It's in the respect you show, the empathy you now practice daily." He paused, allowing his words to settle in. "You've done something incredible. You've created a place where people of all backgrounds, races, and walks of life are treated with dignity. And that's what this hospital should always be about." There were smiles around the room. Nurses nodded, doctors exchanged glances, and the atmosphere was one of genuine pride. They had come a long way. But Dr. Harris knew that the true test would always be the future, the hospital's continued commitment to growth and inclusion. "I won't pretend there aren't challenges ahead," Dr. Harris continued, his voice soft but firm. "But I am confident that together, we will continue to rise to them. You've shown that change is possible. And that's what matters most." The room fell into a brief silence. And then, as if on cue, a round of applause broke out. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was sincere. It was a recognition of the effort, the struggle, and the transformation that had taken place. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Harris stood at the door, watching his staff filter out of the room. Clara, the nurse who had spoken with him in the break room months ago, passed by and gave him a small, grateful smile. She had changed, and more importantly, the hospital had changed. Dr. Harris stepped outside the room and looked down the long corridor, reflecting on how far they had come. The hospital was no longer just a place of healing, it was a place of true respect, of inclusion, and of compassion. And while there would always be more work to do, the foundation had been laid. He turned and walked back to his office, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the heart of the hospital was beating stronger than ever. And with that, the hospital, once just a place of medicine, had become a symbol of change. Dr. Harris had achieved what he set out to do, but in the process, he had learned something too. True leadership wasn't about having power, it was about empowering others.